finalized. There may not be a windfall hike for central government employees this time around. At least that is the information that we were picking up from Finance Ministry sources. The figure being pegged at 16% on the basic salary. The hike is expected to cost an additional 70,000 crore rupees to the ex-chequer. And while we will get you all the latest from the Finance Minister's residence, where the report is expected to be submitted in just a few minutes from now, Arun Jaitley's press conference there will kick off and, of course, will give us the details on what the 7th Pay Commission has recommended. But remember, the big worry is going to be on the fiscal impact and how the government is likely to adjust its fiscal math. Taking us through the proceedings this evening are going to be a star cast of our guests. Joining us, two prominent economists, Sajid Chinoy of JP Morgan and Shubda Rao of Yes Bank. Sajid, Shubda, appreciate you joining us. We're still waiting for the details, but if we go by what we are picking up from our sources, Finance Ministry sources seem to suggest that they have told the 7th Pay Commission that the fiscal headroom is limited, they are constrained, and hence the recommendations should be aligned to the fiscal headroom. If it is 15%, probably is going to be good news as far as the economy and as far as the fisc is concerned. But if it is the rumored 25% or 20 to 25%, as was being speculated a few days ago, then it could have a very different impact. Sajid, what is your takeaway going to be if it's 15% or if it's about 25% plus?
Well, I think clearly from a fiscal perspective, 15% would be desirable. I think, Shereen, you have to step back and understand the fiscal context in the next year or two. This year, the budgeted consolidation has been only 0.1% of GDP, and the government's had the benefit of a big oil windfall. So compared to last year, I estimate as oil contributed created about 0.5% of GDP in fiscal headroom. Now, if you go forward next year, you don't have incremental headroom being created by oil, and you've got a much larger fiscal consolidation, which is about 0.4% of GDP. If you therefore add, anything above 0.2 or 0.3% in terms of higher wages, that means you have to find other space of about 0.7 or 0.8%. And my worry is you don't want to have to find that space by cutting public investment, because frankly, that's the only game in town right now to jumpstart private investment. So I think the big message here is, how do you find a way to preserve public investment and reduce the fiscal deficit by accommodating a relatively moderate increase in public sector wages? Okay,
again, this is, of course, source-based information at this point in time. I am going to caveat that till we actually hear from the Finance Minister. But just a short while ago, our colleague Sapna Das was picking up from sources and senior sources in the Finance Ministry that the fiscal impact may in fact be 0.5% of the GDP in the first year, and that works out to additional cost of about 70,000 crore rupees, and the first tranche of spending will in fact be factored in the coming budget. So quick comment from you, Sajid, and then I'll go to Shubda.
I think that'll be big. That'll be very big. 0.5% of GDP, a fiscal cost is large. Remember, in the previous Pay Commission, you had 0.4% in the first year, 0.3% in the second. If you have to increase public sector wages by 0.5%, and you have to reduce the deficit by 0.4% as the fiscal medium-term plan lays out, you have to find almost 1% of GDP in other sources. And that's going to be a significant challenge.
Shubda, your comments on if it is in fact 0.5% of GDP and if it works out to about 70,000 crore rupees as the cost to the ex-chequer, what would the implications be as far as the fisc is concerned?
I think quite clearly we believe that if it is a 0.5, as the government seems to be indicating, it's bad news because, we are yet to see capex from the private sector side this year, and partly the next year we will continue and need to see government reviving the capex, and the axe will quite clearly then fall on the development expenditure of the government, and that is going to be a point of worry. So very clearly the government will need to be more prudent in the terms of how they revise the, through the 7th Pay Commission recommendations, what kind of recommendations they adopt, both in terms of revision as well as arrears, how do they stagger, etc. That becomes important because you really don't want to once again stoke price pressures through demand. We have seen that happen in the past to an extent. And more importantly, as Sajid was also alluding to, do we want to see the path of fiscal consolidation getting derailed? Yeah. Most certainly not. And the past 5th and 6th Pay Commissions did actually pose a certain threat, as a result of which we did have FRBM them, come into vogue. So it's going to be important for the government to really walk on a fine balancing act in terms of revising the pay scales while monitoring that there is no fiscal slippage. And also, I think on inflation, it becomes an equally important point to be looking at this point in time.
You're absolutely right. Sajid, let's take that point forward on this fine balancing act. If you look at the comments that have come in from the government, the finance minister on CNBC TV 18 and, of course, publicly reiterating over and over again that we want to continue on the path of fiscal consolidation, that we're very mindful and conscious as far as the FRBM limits are concerned, and we don't intend to cross those red lines, ensuring that we will meet the fiscal deficit target not just of this year but even of next year. And at this point in time, as Shubda was pointing out, private capex hasn't picked up. The government has also tried to allay concerns on expenditure cuts, because at this point in time you really need the government to step up expenditure. But on this fine balancing act, do you believe that what you've heard so far from the government and the actions so far would demonstrate that they would be able to be prudent fiscally?
So far the government needs a lot of credit because they've walked the talk. I think, whether it's minimum support prices where they've shown fiscal restraint, or the fact that they're going to stick to their fiscal target, or the fact that they've increased public investment, capital expenditure year on year is growing at very strong levels. So therefore, I think given their belief that they need to stick to fiscal consolidation and their desire to maintain or increase public investment levels to stoke private investment, I would be very surprised if the government were to accept recommendations which increases the wage bill by as much as 0.5% of GDP. It would be out of character with all that they have said and done in the last 6 months. I'll just make one final point. It really depends what prism you're looking at this from, because some people will argue that this would be good for consumption.
Yeah.
We need higher demand, we need domestic demand because external demand is weak. But remember, ultimately this is a trade-off, because the more fiscal space you devote to consumption, the less fiscal space there will be for public investment, given that the overall envelope is fixed.
You preempted my question, so let me put that point to Shubda. Shubda, the point that Sajid was making, and this has been something that a lot of people have been talking about, that the 7th Pay Commission in that sense is going to act as a stimulus, it's going to act as a catalyst for consumption. Do you believe that that case is perhaps overstated in the short term?
I think so, yes. Government so far has refrained from quick fix solutions. They have actually been emphasizing on a more tenable, durable and sustainable path towards growth. And that is quite evident, as Sajid was also talking about earlier, that with rural demand remaining relatively weak, they have refrained from, the temptation of raising MSPs or rural wages or whatever. So I think the government has so far been, very responsible in their action. It will be very, very important to see how they maintain this path, because while in a short term you will get some revival in consumption, through the stimulus package, so to speak. But I think in the end, if it's going to derail the inflation story, which has been a credible achievement so far, I think it's not in totality, it's not going to be a net positive for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are still waiting by for the finance minister and the members of the 7th Pay Commission. They will be, of course, you're getting visuals all set and ready, waiting for the finance minister to make the announcement. But Sajid, let's just talk about the fiscal challenges. We were talking about the benefits that we've got on account of the windfall gains because of oil prices falling. But, on the other side, disinvestment, abysmally short. Now, the government is trying to shore that up by another 10% stake sale as far as Coal India is concerned, and it seems that they will be faced with more fiscal challenges in comparison to the previous year.
Absolutely right. I think this year we're still expecting that the 3.9 will be reached, because you began at 4%. What you had to do was only 0.1%, and you've got a lot of buoyancy in indirect taxes, both because of higher oil taxes, which the government was wise to impose, as well as the fact that you're seeing some pickup in underlying economic activity. So I think this year is not the challenge. The challenge is really next year and the year after. Remember, we have to go from 3.9 to 3% in 2 years. that's nearly a 1% of GDP fiscal consolidation. Now, if growth were to miraculously pick up sharply and you get a lot of revenue buoyancy, you can crowd in the fiscal consolidation.
But that doesn't seem to be playing out, is it, Sajid?
Right. Exactly. Which is why I think that the challenge over the next 2 years is very significant. And I've been saying for a very long time that one way of achieving that fiscal consolidation without it being a very significant drag to economic growth is through asset sales. Because to the extent that you can boost asset sales in the next 2 years, you can simultaneously reduce the fiscal deficit and not have to cut back very sharply on public investment. So I think let's not underestimate the challenge for next year, because there is no oil windfall. There is a more ambitious target. You want to keep public investment high, which is why tonight becomes so important, because if the wage, at least for the next year or two, the wage bill is contained, it just makes it much more manageable for the government.
Absolutely. But Shubda, let's talk about the growth story. And the government continues to maintain that they're confident of being able to do 8% plus. 8.4 is the target for this particular financial year. But all indications seem to suggest that that is likely to be missed, even though the optimism at the government end remains. What's your own growth estimate for this financial year as well as the next?
Yeah, that's right, Shereen. I think perhaps 8 and 8.4 at this point appears like a wishful thinking to us. We are looking at somewhere close to 7.5% for the current year. And if, things go well, particularly on monsoon front and, the rest of the global conditions is abating somewhat, I think overall we could see an upside to the next year's, subsequent year's growth closer to 8%. But I think 50 basis point is somewhere we do not see an improvement over the next year or so. So quite clearly 8 and 8.4 seems at this point more of a wishful thinking.
Sajid, what's your growth estimate?
Well, we just marked it down to 7.4% yesterday. I think the larger point here, Shereen, is we spoke about the impact of oil on fiscal. Remember, India's got a massive terms of trade shock from lower oil prices, which has boosted growth this year. Our estimate is that over the last 4 quarters across 2 fiscal years, the terms of trade shock was 2% of GDP, and our estimates are about two-thirds of that was spent, which means in the last 4 quarters, about 1.3 percentage points of growth was attributable to this one-time windfall from oil. Now, the important point is it's a one-time windfall. So going forward, we don't have the benefit of that oil impact on growth, and the other organic drivers of growth, reforms, private investment, will have to do the heavy lifting. So I think the growth challenge is large, but I'm encouraged by what I've heard in the last week or two. The government seems determined to press ahead. It is a 100 small steps approach, but I think as long as we go down that road, and if we can achieve some success in Parliament, both with the bankruptcy bill, with the GST, I think the impact of those things on productivity growth down the road, a year, 2 years from now, cannot be overstated.
Yeah, Shubda, just to get your comments as we wait by for the Finance Minister to make the announcement on the 7th Pay Commission recommendations, but just your comments on the reform measures that have been announced by the government, and there's been a slew of them. About a week ago, it was the FDI-related reforms which were ratified by the Cabinet yesterday. Yesterday, we saw more measures on the infrastructure side, and in fact, this evening, just a short while ago, the Vijay Kelkar panel that has been set up to overhaul the public-private partnership mechanism has submitted its report to the Finance Minister as well. So on the back of what you're seeing, at least as far as the infrastructure side of the reform piece is concerned, how confident would you feel about a pickup as far as private capex is concerned?
Quite clearly, I think government has made its message and shared its message loud and clear that whatever happens politically, its focus on growth, incentivizing, growth is going to remain rock solid. As you said, FDI was the first point. But I would think, largest piece of infrastructure, particularly led by power sector, I think the missing piece of reform was in the arena of discoms. And I think the whole approach towards dealing with the discom issues of balance sheet problems to be fixed. I think that is also a starting point. We already have seen, sequential improvement in the road sector in terms of policy support. So roads, power sector, these are very critical in bringing in the piece of, revival of growth. Into your question of private sector revival, I think, the first piece is definitely going to be on the government side. We will need to see, and we have seen actually the evidence of high frequency indicators like the capital goods, smooth in series, which actually is showing a positive trend, which to my mind is going to eventually, with a quarter or two, also going to, spill over to some extent into the private sector appetite. Let's not forget, private sector appetite is getting constrained because of two concerns. One is, of course, the deleverage issue of the balance sheets that they need to carry out. Second is on the banking sector appetite, because unless and until we free up some credit appetite on the banking sector by systematically addressing the NPL issues, these two factors are going to restrain growth. So I think it's going to be a slow progress, but definitely policy impetus is going to give an added fillip to this momentum that we are now seeing to be turning for a positive.
Yeah, well, Sajid, I'm just looking at all the unauthenticated information that's coming in on social media via Twitter and so on and so forth. And I'm just looking at one tweet which says that the biggest splash of the 7th Pay Commission will be that it recommends uniform OROP for civilians, military and central police forces. So, of course, you've got the Pay Commission and its impact as far as the fisc is concerned. And then you also have to deal with the OROP issue, which works out to about between 8 and 12,000 crores. And that's the finance minister with A.K. Mathur, Justice A.K. Mathur handing over the recommendations of the 7th Pay Commission report. Sajid, continue while we show those pictures.
No, Shereen, why speculate on what the contents are? We'll know soon enough. I think the larger point is what you made. I think the government's mindful of what the fiscal challenge is. I think they're mindful of how important it is to maintain those public investment levels. So I think it'll be out of character for the government to have a significant reflation of the wage bill, which crowds out other sources of investment.
You're absolutely right. We're still waiting for more details from the government. Of course, we've just seen the report being handed out by Justice A.K. Mathur, who's handed over the report and the recommendations of the 7th Pay Commission. But